Welcome to CivilNet. I'm Sareen Habeshian. Our guest today is Rafael Oganesyan, the founder of the Armenian Election Study, or ARM-ES. And he's also an instructor at the University of Las Vegas. Rafael is working on the first scholarly-driven analysis of the Armenian voter. Starting in 2017, ARM-ES sampled over 1,000 households about their economic perceptions, political preferences, and more. ARM-ES is the only survey that has a record of citizens' political behaviors prior to the Velvet Revolution. Thank you for being with us today, Rafael.
Well, thank you for having me, sorry.
Of course. Why is voting behavior important to understand? What does it tell us?
So the reason voting behavior is important, on one hand, it can retrospectively trace the behavior of our citizens when they participate in the most formal manner, that is, voting. Prospectively, it's important because voter behavior analysts, we can actually predict how voters will vote before the election is over. So what's called voter forecasting models. So on one hand, we can look back and assess whether voters hold their officials accountable or not. On the other hand, we can prospectively or proactively forecast elections even before they are over.
And what have you forecasted so far about these upcoming elections?
So, not really using a forecasting model, but based on what we're getting, and we've, as of today, we've sampled over 900 households, and we're going to do this right until Saturday, right until the day before the election. And what it's looking like, it's not really a surprise. It's going to be a clear victory for the My Step coalition. Our numbers are quite similar than with other more internationally poll companies. So we're a survey, and most of the other organizations that exist in Armenia, they're polls. So polls tend to be shorter questions. The questions are not as theoretically or empirically engaging, whereas surveys are more long-term. They do about 15, 20 minutes at least. So based on our analysis, My Step is looking like to take about between 65 to 68% of the vote. The real competition remains for third place. It's expected that Prosperous Armenia will come in second. So the election, if I was to sum up the Armenian 2018 parliamentary election, I would say this is an election for third place.
How is your surveying done, logistically speaking?
So logistically, Armenia is quite interesting, right? Armenia is one of the few countries where you actually have more phone numbers than you have citizens, according to a recent Freedom House report, that there's more mobile numbers subscribed mobile number of subscribers in Armenia than there are actually Armenians living in Armenia. Now, regarding telephone surveys, what we initially did, so in 2017 when we started the survey, we asked for some information from the mobile providers and from landline providers to basically understand what is the distribution of their subscribers. So for example, let's say VivaCell, they have about 40% of all mobile subscribers. Then we would parallel that to our sample to make it more representative. Armenia also presents a rather difficult challenge because around 32% of all voters are in Yerevan. So they're located in one rather large city, which then forces us to not only look at Yerevan, but also go into the different districts like Khanakher, Zeytun, and go into districts and see what is the distribution of population there and what are the mobile subscribers there. So on one hand, it's easier because there's not a lot of mobile companies. There's essentially Beeline and also, as I recall, Ucom. And then there's 3 mobile mobile companies, large enough mobile companies that we can look at. So initially in 2017, we had this information. So we modeled it around what we had to have a representative sample. And in 2018, we're simply revisiting the panel. The goal here in 2018 is that to revisit the 1,062 households that we sampled and try to get a high enough number of a successful revisit, because obviously phone numbers change, people's lives change, so there's no guarantee that we will revisit successfully each of the 1,062 households. But we've tried our best, and currently we're at over 300 panel visits. So of the 1,062, we have successfully revisited 300 people that we talked to a year ago. And that's very important because we are able to gauge the change in people's political behavior and their perception of the economy and to see. So for example, an interesting question is, there's clear support for Pashinyan and the My Step Alliance. Well, where is the support coming from? Are Republican voters more likely to identify with Pashinyan now than are prosperous Armenian voters? So where's his support base coming from? Because in our first wave, the Yelk Alliance only got anywhere between 8 to 12% in our survey. So it's clear there's a big discrepancy between the mid 60% that he's getting right now and the single digits he got last time, right? So where are these 50% of these new voters? Who are they? And that's what we're trying to tap at with our panel study.
And why hasn't this been done before?
So
in Armenia?
In Armenia, we've seen polls, right? We've seen Gallup come here. We've seen various other sociological organizations conduct surveys, most famously the Cox's Barometer. What distinguishes the Armenian Election Study is this is an election study. It's a survey that is centered around the election, right? We do not ask questions that have nothing to do with the election. Moreover, each of our questions is theoretically justified, right? If I was, so for example, we ask a set of questions that are related to what's called political sophistication. So in this survey, we ask, who's the prime minister? Who's the president? What year did Armenia become independent? And how many members in parliament? As you can see, the questions, they get harder as you move on. And the idea behind that is research shows that individuals who are what's called political sophisticates or are knowledgeable about the constitutional framework of the country or the political situation in the country, they are more likely to vote based on their pocketbook. So they're more likely to relate changes in their pocketbook with performance of the government.
Rafael, you've spoken about how the diaspora is invested in Armenia's future. What are the role of remittances in economic growth, and what other avenues are there for participating?
So Armenia is an interesting case study, right? Armenia, obviously there's more Armenians living outside than inside. What that naturally does to a country, you see a large increase in flow of remittances. And mainly our remittances come from Russia, from the US, and Europe. The greater the role that remittances plays in a given country, the higher the probability of an external event or an external shock impacting the recipient country. So for example, in Armenia, when the sanctions against Russia kicked in, Armenia witnessed little stagnation in growth because the remittances decreased from Russia. Now, unfortunately, the role of remittances may also threaten political accountability. Those that receive remittances are less likely to hold their officials accountable. And Armenia, maybe one can ask, well, if one supports this popular uprising, one can ask, well, what took so long, right? 30 years. One question that we can gauge is, well, Armenia is a country that has a higher form of remittances. And research suggests that a society that receives remittances is less likely to hold its elected officials accountable, because whether the elected official engages in, let's say, informal business transactions, the voter may not necessarily care about accountability because they're receiving a given or a fixed amount, either monthly or quarterly, so they are less likely to hold their elected officials accountable for any economic disparity they may go through.
Coming to the elections, what are you looking out for in terms of your surveying of voter behavior?
So in terms of our survey, the way we structured it is we're essentially looking at these two major theoretical foundations of voter behavior. The first is referred to as the sociological perspective. The sociological perspective says that voting is influenced by social groups. So for example, I'm a member of, let's say, the age group of 18 to 35, or I'm a male, or I'm from Yerevan as opposed to rural areas, and that can influence my vote. What we found is in 2017, and obviously hindsight 2020, what we found in 2017 is the #1 predictor against the incumbent vote, which 2017 is the Republican Party of Armenia, was a person's age. Meaning what we did is we isolated post-Soviet Armenian citizens, basically Armenians who were born after the fall of the Soviet Union. And what we found was that group of people who were born after the Soviet Union were about 9 percentage points less likely to vote for the RPA. And the reason I say it's hindsight 2020, because as we saw, the popular uprising was largely led by a youth movement. And our 2017 results showed that sociologically, the #1 predictor of the vote against the Republican Party was a person's age. Now there's also what's referred to as psychological perspectives of voting, whereas sociological perspectives may place you within a group. I'm a male, I'm young, I'm from the city. A psychological perspective is more individual based, your psychological attachment to an ideology, to a political party. Now, mind you, these are Western theories of voter behavior, right? So in the West, in the US, for example, there's party establishment. Both parties have been around well over 100 years. There's some form of ideological orientation, conservative, liberal. In Armenia, this is quite questionable, right? In Armenia, individuals don't identify with the party as much. So unfortunately, what we're looking at, and this survey further justifies this, is only about 25% of Armenians identify with a party. When asked whether they feel close to a party, over 75% say, no, they don't. And the reason is because political parties here have lacked a stable platform, and they've largely been vehicles of personalities. So thus, the reason in our model we're seeing sociological traits dominate psychological traits is because psychologically, partisan attachment in Armenia is not as strong as what we're seeing in other countries. In fact, partisan attachment in the post-Soviet space is not as strong. That being said, partisanship matters. If you're psychologically attaching yourself to one party or another, despite the fact that you're doing this out of personality reasons, maybe you like the leader of the party, he's charismatic or she's charismatic, maybe you like their policy, but if you're attaching yourself to that party, you're more likely to vote for that party. Now, one might say, well, of course, that's sort of the norm, but remember, that is not 100% of the time. As we've seen throughout other countries, there's people who feel they're members of one party, but then when election time comes, they may judge that party too harshly, they may be disenfranchised, and they vote for another party. So in Armenia, the reason this is important in Armenia, these two theories, is because in Armenia we're sort of seeing this, the birth of these two approaches. Armenia is part of the post-Soviet space. The post-Soviet space is the most infant region with regard to voter behavior. Remember, these are countries that 30 years ago were under a one-party state. So whereas parts of Africa or even Latin America are rather new democracies, this post-Soviet region is a newer playing field. Parties have only existed for several years, and not discounting some parties that have existed prior to Armenia's second or recent republic. Best example is this coming election. So we have alliances that have been just formed. We have parties that have just been formed that did not even exist in the previous election. So thus tracing how partisanship develops in Armenia is essentially sort of a laboratory of political behavior.
Well, thank you, Rafael. Thank you for being here with us and for sharing your expertise. Thanks for watching CivilNet. I'm Sareen Habeshian. See you next time.